This is Faith Not Included. It is the show where we discuss those crazy claims and conspiracy theories. It is a part of the Atheist Network group. I'm your host, Skids the Clown. With me this week, the man who needs no introduction, yet I'm here introducing him right now. Director Wes. Yes, Wes. I introduced you just like you asked me to. Sorry about Wes, everybody. He thinks I'm going to say something stupid, which is probably true, but we can still have fun anyway, so let's start out with some headlines. Failed U.S. House candidate and QAnon conspiracy theorist Deanne Lorraine made an appearance on the Stu Peters show recently, where she spoke out against the idea of having separate seating sections for vaccinated and non-vaccinated spectators at sporting events and other large gatherings. And as you've probably already guessed, it did not take her long to compare the proposal to that of the Nazis and Jim Crow. Now, for those of you who do not know, Deanne Lorraine has been a COVID-19 denier and anti-vaxxer. Now, she said, quote, "They're going to start dividing up the sections of sporting events, churches, and other areas of public interest. It's going to say vaccinated people and non-vaccinated people. And we know, because there are so many mindless sheeple out there," I wonder who she's actually talking about in that one, "that the vaccinated section is going to be a hell of a lot bigger than the non-vaccinated section. But that's how it's going to be. So sporting events, if you're going to a baseball game, a football game, etc., you have to expect to be put in a different section where you've been vaccinated or not." Unquote. At this point, host Stu Peters responded, "I'm actually okay with it because I really don't want to be hanging out with those vaccinated people. All this talk about transmission and shedding and all this other stuff, I mean, this is going to be a contagious vaccination. It's a self-spreading vaccination. If only they put this much worry into the actual pandemic when that was a thing." Lorraine replied with, "Don't shit on me. We need to start having don't shit on me flags everywhere." What is this fascination with flags amongst these right-wing conspiracy theorists? I just don't get why they have to have flags everywhere. She continued, "I don't want to be hanging out with the vaxxed anyway." The vax? She's saying that like it's a pejorative. I mean, seriously. She continues, "But just imagine a year ago. Did we ever think that this was going to happen? If we did, we were going to be labeled conspiracy theorists with tinfoil hats." There's a reason for that. But imagine what the Jews experienced, right? Again, we go back to the Holocaust. See, I told you this is where we were going with this. Where they had to show papers. Yes, she said it twice. They had to wear a gold star. Isn't this eerily familiar to that? We have to show our papers. She's obsessing about showing papers. We have to show proof of vaccination, and it's going to be separating people from the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. It's also going to be like back in the days where racism was paramount, and they had separate water fountains, separate schools, separate eating areas for blacks and whites. How is this any different? End real quote. Well, Deanne, if you don't know the difference between Jim Crow and the separation of people based on colors and the actual idea of separating vaccinated and unvaccinated people to keep a pandemic under control, that is your problem. When thinking up ideas for the main subject of this show, Wes suggested that we cover yaks. Now, I was not too sure that we could do such a topic, but after doing some research, I found a lot of great things we can talk about. Yaks are dumb, hairy, smelly beasts that usually live in herds and... What do you mean I've got it wrong? I'm doing what you told me to do. Oh, yeah, Young Earth Creationists. Dumb, hairy, smelly beast. I think this still will work. Oh, come on! That was too easy! Fine. Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to call you hairy. Young Earth Creationists are people who actually take the Bible very literally. In fact, they've determined the age of the earth using the Bible's genealogy as a method to date how far back from today's date we have to go to get to the beginning of time. Notable Young Earth Creationists include Kent Hovind, Ray Comfort, and Ken Ham. How am I not supposed to say that looks like a yak? I mean, seriously. According to Young Earth Creationists, the Earth is only about 6,000 to 7,000 years old. Now, this goes against what scientific research shows based on many different fields of study. This includes history, cosmology, geology, and evolution. But don't take my word on it. I'm just some internet clown. We can ask a lot smarter people than me what they think about Young Earth Creationists. In fact, that's exactly what I did. I spoke with a close personal friend of mine, Dr. Josh, to get the historical take on what he thinks about Young Earth Creationism. Hey Wes, roll that clip.
Skids the Clown. Yeah, I don't know who that is. I don't know that I want to do a show with a clown. I'm a serious scholar.
The other clip. No, not that clip.
Looking back, if you go back 6,000 or 7,000 years, between 4 and 5,000 BCE. I mean, we know a lot about those periods. That's not historical information in the sense that we don't have writing, because writing doesn't come about until the end of the 4th millennium. Like in the 5th millennium, you have the Ubaid period, I think, and then of course in the 4th millennium you have the Uruk period, and these are like from an archaeological perspective. And before that, you had the Hassuna and Samara periods, and then before that, the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B. It's just there's a lot of information that archaeology gives us. In the past 12,000 years. It's just what we're talking about here. So, the idea that there was nothing before, let's be very generous, if there's nothing before 5,000 BCE, that's just sort of silly. Now, of course, I'm sure the pushback would be, well, how do you date that? And how do you know that? And nobody can give somebody that asks that question, a 2-year intro to archaeology course. In a show like this. So that's what do they say, that the fool can ask more questions than the wisest man can ever answer.
Very interesting. I have like 100 questions to ask, but those can wait for later. Why don't you continue?
One of the things that I think is highly misunderstood by a lot of Young Earth Creationists, probably all of them, is the genre of the Hebrew Bible, right? And not the Hebrew Bible as a whole, but the different genres that appear in it, and particularly that in the primeval history. So Genesis 1 through 11, like what's going on there? Is this, is this an attempt at writing history? Is this, when you read through Genesis 1, is this supposed to be the writer or writers setting down the facts of history as he knew them? Is it an attempt to be scientific in that sense? What is the primeval history doing? And I think when you look at the rest of the ancient Near East and you look at the other, pieces of literature that we have that vastly predate the biblical text, it becomes very clear that there's something else going on in the early chapters of Genesis. A friend of mine used to teach Genesis, I think it was. It was the class up at Moody Bible Institute. Mm-hmm. And he was an evangelical Christian, went to Hopkins with me. And he wanted them to understand the genre of Genesis 1 and the genre of Genesis 6 through 9, the flood story and things like it. So what he did is he would have them read the ancient Near Eastern mythological texts that corresponded to them first. So if you're going to read through the flood account, let's read through Achahasis, right? Let's read through Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh, and let's read through the Sumerian flood story. And then once you kind of have a handle on what's going on there, now let's turn to Genesis 6 through 9. And it's like the light goes off, right? Oh, this is doing something, right? This text is not supposed to be scientific or purely historical in that sense. It's doing something. And when you look at Genesis 1 through 11, it's very clear that the writer who's editing this stuff all together is doing so in such a way to show the evil nature of man juxtaposed to the just nature and righteous character of God. So if you think about the creation story, God is doing all these things and he creates them in Genesis 1. Good. They're all good. Very good. By the time you get to Genesis 11, you've had, the first sin of humanity in chapter 3. You've had the first murder in chapter 4. You've had this decline that in Genesis 6, 1 to 4, with the fallen angels and, having sex with human women and all these terrible things. Every thought of every human's heart all the time was only wicked continually. And God is perfectly justified then in wiping them all out and starting over again. And that's what he does. He does it with Noah. And of course, immediately after the flood, Noah and his line fall into sin, right? And that deteriorates down into, chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel, where all the people, instead of spreading out and being, the image bearers that are supposed to go out and to repopulate the earth and to take dominion over it, like you see in Genesis 1 and then Genesis 9. No, they've all come together. And they've come together to build this tower up to heaven. In other words, they're doing the exact opposite of what God wanted them to do. And so God has to confound their languages and spread them out. They fail. All of humanity fails. And so God again starts over by choosing Abraham, right? This chosen nation. And even it goes further than this, and then I'll stop. But as you go through the book, the book of Genesis into Exodus and Numbers, you start to see, particularly in the book of Numbers, see over and over again God's chosen nation that he's called out of Egypt and that he's keeping secure and alive through the wilderness. They rebel. And several times God says, that's it, I'm starting over. I'm going to wipe them all out, right? Moses, I'm starting over with you. And Moses has to kind of talk him down, right? So this is a literary pattern that we see. And if you can understand that, it becomes very clear that you shouldn't be going to texts like this, going, okay, this person lived for 969 years, and this person lived for 747. When you add those up, and then there's some overlap here for that. And so that means stop, right? That's not what the text is doing. The text is, it's literary, and it's doing something to tell you a theological point.
So, according to Dr. Josh, the narrative of the Bible doesn't quite line up with the historical record that we have. That's not a good sign for young Earth creationists. But what about cosmology? Is there something that cosmology can help reveal that would help validate young Earth creationism? Well, I asked Dr. David his view on the idea of a young universe. And he was super excited to have a real intellectual conversation with me. So here's what he had to say. Roll it, Wes.
What is the point of this? I like to talk about science, but I like to talk about science with people who have an interest in science and have some sense of the way things are at a basic level. I'm not an elementary school teacher.
I'm not sure what he meant by that. But Wes, roll the other clip.
Various observations, various different kinds of observations, all point to the Earth being 4.5 billion years old, and the universe being quite a bit longer, quite a bit older than that. We can tell how far things are, and therefore how long it took signals, how long it took light to reach us, right? So for example, you have a light bulb. We can do a simple experiment in the laboratory and measure the speed of light. And if you know the luminosity of your source of light, you can figure out how far, and you know how far that object is. You can evaluate the time it takes for light to reach you. And the distances that we get are incompatible with the time scales of thousands of years. We need orders and orders of magnitude longer time scales for most of what we see out there in the universe.
Interesting. Well, what about the idea that light came before the stars in the Bible?
Well, where does light come from has to do with other physics. And so all of that physics has to make sense. And so you're asking a question ultimately about how stars form, when stars form, where do stars form, right? So there's a long history of this. And for all of this to make sense, right, for us to be able to make sense of the elements that we see out there in the universe, that has something to do with stars. And the formation of stars. And so for you to postulate that light was on its way without asking what produced light leaves all sorts of things unanswered. And physics has answered those questions. These are not unknowns. God is separate. God cannot be included in the scientific idea because that kind of idea isn't amenable to predictions. Or when you say God does this or God does that, unless God always does that, right? In which case you can say then that's a rule, and we have discovered laws of the universe, in a sense, rules, if you will, the rules of physics. And some people say, well, that there's a divine origin to that. But what science can do is uncover patterns. But if you want to bring in something that's arbitrary, that's sort of ad hoc, right? It's the result of whim, you can't include that in the scientific theory, because when you do the experiment this time, you have to get the same results when you do the experiment again. Many groups have to do the experiment. They have to get the same results. So, right, if your explanation has, well, on this day I wanted to do this, and on this other day I wanted to do that, you can't bring that into a scientific explanation unless you can have a conversation with whoever's doing whoever's making the decisions, right? We wouldn't be able to make sense of most of of our data if that were true. None of cosmology would make any sense.
So it seems that the cosmological perspective also does not agree with young Earth creationism. Well, maybe they're going to have better luck with geology. I recently spoke with Dr. Kelly Laughlin, who is a geologist, and had a little bit to say about the age of the Earth. Hey, let's roll that clip.
Really? Seriously? You put this up with a real clown with me? Seriously?
Really? We're just going to keep doing this, right?
Well, one thing I can say is that we do have a way to date rocks. And we do that because there is a element known as zircon. And zircon, when it forms, often has bits of uranium or thorium in its makeup. And because we know the radioactive decay rate of those, we can tell by the amount of lead which they decay into that is still left in the zircon crystals how old that crystal is. It's actually one of the most accurate forms of radiometric dating that we have. And we've dated the rocks back to 6.5 billion years ago. So we know that the Earth is at least that old. This isn't carbon dating. That's for using dating organic materials, and this is something that's used for dating non-organic materials. And that's why we're using zircon and not, say, a sample of a tooth or a bone sample or some charcoal left over from a fire to date. We're actually dating the rocks themselves. It's a completely different method. We do know the radioactive decay rate of uranium and thorium. We know how long it's going to take them to turn into lead. So we can see how much thorium or uranium is there and how much lead is there, and we can know how much time has passed by for that much lead that had been formed by the uranium or thorium.
So the idea of a young Earth does not fare any better through the study of geology. So where do we go from here? I decided our last stop was going to be the study of evolution. And to get a really good perspective on this, I decided to ask internet famous atheist Aron Ra, who was really thrilled to be on the show. Roll it, Wes.
What show is this?
Okay, that's it. I'm out of here. I mean, how long do I have to put up with?
The problem is the definition of kind. Now, creationists have no idea what the hell they're talking about ever. But when what they mean by kind is that God created something, and initially it was every species. God created every individual species. So my yellow-headed Amazon parrot is, similar to this other Amazon parrot. They're different species. They were separate creations. God created all these different parrots that are almost exactly alike, just like God created 7,000 different species of scorpions that are almost exactly alike. But then creationists realize, Noah can't fit all these things on his boat. It's absolutely every different species. So you have to allow that speciation can happen. When Darwin said that speciation can happen, the creationists were in an uproar. But then as they started as their understanding of the world exceeded beyond their own barnyard, they began to realize, there's a hell of a lot of different species out there. And there's no way you could fit all of these things into a single football field. Can't happen. So they had to come up with an excuse. So now they allowed for speciation to happen. And then they went beyond that too. They said not just that species could happen, but that new genera can happen. So you have a new genus for a collection of species. And then you can have a number of different genera within a family. Some creationists are arguing for that. So they'll push the boundary back as far as they need to without recognizing the fact that macroevolution is speciation and always was speciation. So if you accept that new species can evolve, that means that and creationists do. They readily accept that new species can evolve. And the species, it's like when you take one population and you divide it, or if it is accidentally divided, like migrations or whatever, so different groups of animals will end up in two different places. Differences continue to build up through mutations, and they become increasingly distinct. And eventually you'll have different breeds. You have a pit bull and a dachshund. The people will accept that those are both the same species, but eventually they become so different that they no longer interbreed. It's not just that they can't interbreed, but they probably wouldn't if they could. They don't. So once they separate, they don't interbreed anymore. They no longer bring forth. In a sense, they become different kinds within the same kind. So the Bible could be talking about clades. I mean, the Bible does say that there are all kinds of birds, right? And there's every sort of bird. Well, what is a kind and what is a sort? Both of them are the Hebrew word min, which means that can interbreed and bring forth after their kind. So there's a definition of species, and you can also make an interpretation that you have monophyletic clades, which is exactly what evolution teaches. Creationists don't understand that because they don't want to. Because they want to understand, they want to believe in one of the contradictions. Well, you see, but that part, the part you read to me from Genesis, We can justify that. We can have a very poetic interpretation to say that that's true. But when you get into the guy being created as a golem spell, and then the rib girl, and no, none of that, and the Noah's flood, all of that none of that happened. That's for certain.
This has been Faith Not Included. If you enjoyed what you saw today, and if you did, you must be a yak. I said yak, not yak. Come on. Anyway, if you liked what you saw today, make sure you hit that like button down there. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so now. You could also hit that notification button to be notified when new content comes available. So, from Skids the Clown and Director Wes, we'll see you next time. Hey everyone, I really hope you enjoyed this premiere episode. We put a lot of work into it, and I would love to hear some of your feedback. Or anything I can do to make this show better would go a long ways. This show is fun for me, but it's for everybody in the audience. So definitely hit me up with any suggestions or anything you would have that I can do to improve the show. Also, immediately after the end of the stream, we're going to head over to the Discord channel, and we'd love to chat, get feedback, just hang out and have fun. So once again, I want to reach out and thank Dr. Josh, Dr. David, Kelly Laughlin, and Aron Ra for helping me put this together. Definitely want to thank Director Wes for keeping me in line. As you can see, he's got his hands full with that. And Oz and everybody else at Tang for giving me a platform to put the show. So once again, for Faith Not Included, I'm Skids the Clown. Everybody have a great night.